Welcome everybody. We are recording, as you just heard, this meeting, and we encourage people to participate. Please ask questions in the chat. Please keep your microphones muted during the webinar unless we ask you to actually give your question at the end. And certainly at the end, you can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask questions. When asking questions, please keep them brief and to the point. I think most people have introduced themselves in the chat already. If you haven't done so, please do that. And also don't use any AI tools to try to do additional recording or transcription of the webinar, please. We do encourage people to ask questions and to have some sort of debate at the end. And whilst we can't ensure Chatham House rules with such a big audience, we do trust that people will not. I mean, the report itself is public, and you're free to report that, but please don't report what other people are saying or asking in the webinar. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mohib.
Yep, thanks, Nick. Yep, so yeah, Mohib, so it's your show now. Mohib, I must say, he's joining us from Australia and Melbourne, so very much as evening time, so thank you very much. We'll turn it over to you now, Mohib. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's sort of late afternoon or early evening on my end. I'm sure it's different times across different places. I can see some people from Kabul and different parts of Pakistan. Maybe some of them are waiting for iftar as well. Happy Ramadan to all of you who are observing. I'm trying to find the slideshows. Yep, that's good. I think I can see that people can see the presentation. Is that
yes, we can.
It looks good, Mohib.
Great. Thank you.
Looks great.
Okay, so what we are talking, I think, as Alec mentioned, we will be talking about the update of the 2023-24 scenarios that we released, ICAPS released in 2023, late 2023. And then we will look at the outlook or the forward-looking outlook for 2025, 2026. So just to briefly sort of, introduce the report, we conducted a very broad review of the reports and literature on the Afghan economy. We also looked at a lot of data that is available on the Afghan economy. And of course, the Afghan economy, there is, a lot of limitation in terms of data availability. To fill that gap, we undertook interviews with experts on the Afghan economy, including people in the Afghan fund who are slowly becoming sort of a very important part of the Afghan economy or the systems that will ensure that Afghan economy stays stable. I think as I certainly said that robust data on many indicators in Afghanistan is not available, and especially up-to-date data on key indicators such as GDP growth or inflation and all those things are not available to the point we're doing the report. But of course, some historical data and some data is available that we have used in this report. In terms of the I think we sort of talked about the scenarios from 2023. There were 3 scenarios that ACAPS developed. Again, in those scenarios, we also work with experts and use data that was available. So we wanted to sort of look at the economy and say what will happen in the next 2 years, which is 2025. We thought there was a lower probability. I mean, there was not much chance of a high growth scenario, but we still talked about that. We thought in case situation changes quickly for the better, for the positive, there is better international relations, there is more aid, all of those things could, put Afghanistan back on a high growth sort of scenario. And the reason for that was there was a huge collapse in 2021, which we will talk about. We were more confident. We were confident that a medium growth scenario might sort of come to reality. And the reason for that was at least humanitarian aid was flowing at the time. The government showed some stability and some financial stability. And that's why we thought that will happen. The last scenario that we worked with and we sort of put forward was a stagnant or lower growth scenario, which actually was realized. And the reason we were thinking about that is the discussion at the time was that if Afghanistan's international relations deteriorates, if the crisis level, if the sort of the emergency crisis level of humanitarian aid starts to stabilize at a lower level, and if the government cannot maintain its high revenue, and if the remittances and other key sort of financial inflows to Afghanistan sort of slowly tapers off, there might be a chance of even sort of a very low economic growth scenario. This growth was actually realized. This growth scenario was realized in 2023, 2022 and 23. What happened is Afghanistan experienced an economic growth of 0%. 0% anywhere in the world will be a disaster sort of number, and people would be sort of screaming recession. But in Afghanistan, because it had experienced a -6% and then minus in 2022 and minus 20% in 2021, getting to 0% was actually an economic recovery, because that's where things were stabilizing. The economy was not collapsing anymore. Private sector was stabilizing, and all those things were the government's sort of revenue and spending was showing some sign of stability. You know, that to us and to the experts on the Afghan economy was sort of some level of recovery to avoid another contraction. As I said, key figures and key factors in that recovery, which we, you know, to a 0%, but we still call it a recovery, were the 7.1 billion in humanitarian assistance that arrived since between 2022 and 2024. There was stability in public spending. So government revenue has remained between 2.2 to 2.6 billion US dollars. And that sort of that plays a key role in the sort of the stability of the Afghan economy. One of the key factors which plays a very important role, and through multiple channels and through multiple mechanisms, is the improved security situation. Widespread violence has reduced. Afghanistan is no more experiencing a war at all the provinces, and and that has created a condition, that's some condition that allows private sector and other sort of sectors to try to sort of explore and draw on the peace dividend that these kind of situation could produce. Of course, Afghanistan has had other issues that has not allowed for full of the peace dividend to be realized. We can discuss that later. There is also, in 2023, there is also a fragile recovery in private sector. So private sector initially, in 2001 and 2022, experienced a significant collapse. There was widespread business closures, some of them permanent, some of them temporary. But in 2023 and 2024, we have started to see that no more businesses are closing. The businesses that have survived the crisis are continuing to function. Their revenue has increased, and some of those businesses that were temporarily closed has started to reopen, which sort of is fragile again, dependent on that humanitarian aid, on the government sort of spending, and a number of other financial flows that are coming to Afghanistan. What is going to happen in the next 2 years is something that we worked on in this report. So looking into 2025 and 2026. One of the key things that is different in these three scenarios from the previous scenarios is that we no more think, or the experts that we consulted no more believe, that there will be a high growth scenario in Afghanistan because of the conditions that has evolved and the condition that we can see in the country. I'll talk to those conditions a little bit later. We think moderate acceleration of growth is possible. By moderate, we mean 2 to 5% maximum in terms of GDP growth. Continuation of low growth, which is a very high probability. That's what we think, or the economic experts that we talk to, and the ACAP's expert team that is working on the Afghan economy. There is a risk of economic contraction in Afghanistan. Again, why do we think about that? The conditions specifically in terms of the political context that is emerging. Domestically, there is a struggle on the settlement of there is no peace sort of agreement or a transition. Taliban have taken over and they're running the country. Internationally, we think that some of the policies of the Taliban will have repercussions on international donors and their the aid flow. And some of the projects that could have happened if Afghanistan did not experience some of those policies would sort of tells us that there could be an economic contraction, which could again range between a moderate sort of a small contraction of 2 to 3 to 5%, or could be larger than that. Of course, the larger contraction that we are thinking about, the more sort of problematic the international relations of Afghanistan, the aid flows, and all the stability in other financial sector that has happened in the last 2 years will deteriorate by considerable amount. Some of the key consideration that we took into these forward-looking scenarios are changes in aid flow. We're already seeing some reduction in aid flow. That's why we did not think that Afghanistan can again experience a high economic growth scenario. While public revenue are stable and have slightly increased, we think that the threshold of the 2.5, $2.6 billion might be the highest, the peak revenue that can be collected given the economic situation, and that might have has an impact on where economic growth in Afghanistan could stand, whether it will be a continuation of low growth or an economic contraction. Private sector, as I said earlier, it's a fragile growth. It will need some stimulation from some place, whether that comes from foreign aid, whether that comes from the government, or whether that comes from some sort of other financial flows, for example, remittances, which is not highly likely to happen. Again, political context is very, very important. And I think we will get to this a little bit more a little bit later. So this chart shows economic growth in Afghanistan in 2021, 22, and 23. You can see 20.7%, 21% contraction in 2021. This is right after a majority of that contraction happened post August 15 in the 4 or 5 months that were remaining. Overnight, Afghan government was not paying salaries. Overnight, aid agencies were in a state of flux. They didn't know what was happening with their projects. So their salaries and all those things stopped. Afghanistan was, public sector and other sectors were all experiencing, and then sort of comes the humanitarian aid, the stability in public system revenue, and that managed to reduce the contraction from 20% to 6%, which is a huge amount. And then in 2023, there are two estimates. The UNDP and the World Bank estimated the growth at 0%. Afghanistan Statistical Office estimated this at 1.6%. So it could be between somewhere there, and all of that will count as a scenario where Afghanistan did not experience a contraction. Now, with all that sort of macro picture that we presented, how does that affect the Afghan families, the household economy? How is that doing? It continues to be a very challenging situation. 14.2 million people, 33% of the Afghan population, are experiencing acute food insecurity. They are in crisis or emergency food insecurity. This is the IPC classification, phase 3 and phase 4. This is slightly lower than 2022, where the number of people needing acute food security were around 18 million people. It's one of the highest proportion globally, so it's still a very challenging humanitarian context. Some of the examples that households are experiencing are, for example, 62% of households have insufficient income to cover their food needs. This is slightly better than 2022, but it's still very high when more than 50%, or always 2/3 of the population, does not have enough income only to provide food for the family. That's, a crisis is pretty highlighted in that. Another very key statistic is 56% of the household have borrowed money to buy food. During the last year, at some point, they were forced to borrow from someone in the family or somewhere to buy basic needs, food. The sort of shocks, economic shocks, and other shocks play a key role in the humanitarian crisis. And in Afghanistan, there were three key shocks that were identified by household in 2023, and drought was identified by 67%. Again, 2/3 of the population have experienced drought. Economic shock is another sort of area which a huge number of 56%, again, 2/3 of the population. And flooding is another shock that families and households have experienced. What this is telling us that Afghanistan is very prone to natural disasters and the effects of climate change, which ACAPs have done some other work on, and I will encourage you to have a look at that. And of course, since 2021, economic shocks have emerged. For economic shock, what does economic shock include? It includes, for example, the breadwinner, household breadwinner losing their job, or if they have a business, they have to shut down the business because there's no more business to do, or their business revenue or profits decreasing to a level where they cannot sustain a certain life standard, and many other. For example, a failed harvest could also be an economic shock. Flooding, experiencing a disaster that destroys a house and farmland and things like that could also count as economic shock. So there is there are interrelated shocks in that sense. Drought could create economic shock. Flooding could create economic shocks, and that interrelation is sort of obvious in there. So here in this chart, we have shown IPC's estimates of people, in millions of people in Afghanistan who are in emergency or crisis food insecurity, acute food insecurity. The economic recovery that we talked about earlier could be seen here as well. You could see that in 2021, it sort of picks up from 11 million people and goes all the way to 18 million people. And it has slightly started to decrease, which is a good news in a sense that more people are able to self-support and self-sustain their livelihood. But at the same time, it still says that more than one in three people are still dependent on the humanitarian aid that comes to Afghanistan. A key area that we looked at, and I think an important area that we looked at, is to show how the economic condition, the changing economic condition, and the fragile economic condition affected Afghan women and girls. The effects of the policies and the context that is emerging has been very broad and devastating for Afghan women. We focus here on purely on economic indicators to show a number of these effects. For example, women employment decreased by 50% in 2023. It's already very low in Afghanistan. There's only a very small number of mainly urban women are employed in a sense that counts either as an employment or as a business, while Afghan women are involved in non-paid farm and family work that is not counted in this. And this, at the same time, in 2023, employment increased by 11% for Afghan men. So there is a very huge contrast here to see. 29% of women-led businesses were closed compared to only 8% for men. And this is very important to note that women businesses in Afghanistan are not very common. So there were a lot of businesses that worked in different sort of sectors, mainly in women markets and in different places where there were facilities provided for them. And despite that, there is a very strong decline in women-led businesses. One of the latest sort of changes for Afghan women were there's a large number of Afghan women who used to work in public sector. And when the regime changed, when the Afghanistan's government changed, some of these women were asked not to come to work, but their salaries were continued to be paid. In 2023, 2024, we saw that their salaries were capped at 5,000. So that's another huge income blow to those households, that they lost an income through that. Afghan women are affected by these policies and what is happening in the political context of Afghanistan. Another thing that affects Afghan women is sanctions and decline in aid that is sort of dependent on international community in a sense. 30% of Afghan women-led exporters were affected by sanctions. What does that mean? Because many businesses in Afghanistan cannot undertake international transactions, exporters in generally are affected by these conditions. But there were 30% of women-led exporters who said that they were affected by inability to transact internationally or to send their goods internationally. They also pointed to air corridors that were functional during the Republican era, the era of the Republic. And these corridors allowed some of the products that women produce to go to international markets. And the closure of that meant that many women who were using those corridors for their income has also been affected. 5% more women-headed household reported reduction in humanitarian assistance. We will come to this a little bit later, that humanitarian aid has decreased, and because of a reduction in humanitarian aid, the humanitarian assistance available to Afghan household has reduced. During a survey, when women-headed households were asked, has they experienced a reduction in humanitarian assistance? 70% of women said yes, compared to 65% of men. This is significant because there is a considerable proportion of Afghan women who are the head of their household due to, for many reasons, the men in those households are, either away for work or have died in the war, or sort of for many reasons. Many women has overtaken the role of a household head, and in many cases they are more vulnerable because they're also in many cases raising orphan children and other widowed women. So it's a very sort of a difficult situation for that specific category of household. They are also prioritized across all different aid distribution categories. So they're one of the most vulnerable, one of the most prioritized group for humanitarian aid. One of the key area is the ban on secondary and university level education. This will exacerbate the long-term inequality, gender inequality in Afghanistan. Women and girls will be significantly affected by not being able to complete their education and not being able to gain higher education to then be able to have higher salaries and be able to be gainfully and well employed. So that's a very long term. This is a big problem for Afghan economy and Afghan society, but of course for women, it will drive the inequalities even further. Some of the constraints that we took into account when we were working on the scenarios, restriction on women economic participation is a key one. This is going to reduce household income, and through that will affect economic growth in Afghanistan. Inflation or deflation or prices are very have fluctuated very strongly. Prices increased by 18% in 2021 and 22. They have since declined by 9%. What does that mean? Prices have experienced a negative. I mean, they have become lower across many categories in the last year and a half. And there is many reasons for that. Of course, domestic harvest is one reason. The inability of people to purchasing power is another reason. There's many reasons for that. Isolation and sanction of Afghanistan. This is, as I said earlier, Afghan businesses are now isolated from global markets, both in terms of exporting and importing, and in terms of international transaction. This will initially affect the businesses that were active in Afghanistan, but in the long run, it will disallow new businesses to emerge, connected to the international sort of markets and things. Domestic policies, I think we talked to those, especially policies that are affecting women rights to participation, economic participation, are very important in that sense. But of course, all the other policies are also important here. Development aid, the absence of development aid and reduction in humanitarian aid could significantly affect Afghanistan's economy and reduce economic growth. Development aid, we know Afghanistan received up to between $4.9 to $6 billion annually for the last 20 years or many years. And now that that aid is completely absent. It's just not coming to Afghanistan. And the humanitarian aid, which is only a fraction of the total aid Afghanistan received between 2001 and 2021, is also very important and has started to show a declining trend. Fiscal spending or government finances are very important. If government can maintain revenue, that will be important for the economy. But if they cannot, they will have to cut employment and cut spending. And that will again affect the GDP. We have already seen some signs of this. For example, reduction in the salaries of those women who are not allowed to work is a clear sign that there is a struggle. There's also a small budget deficit that there is no source for the government to fill. So we are expecting in the next years that the government will make the budget smaller, especially in the development side, larger projects like construction and infrastructure projects. Again, international financial markets affect Afghanistan in many ways. For example, the lack of flow of investment, which is very important for Afghanistan if it has to experience economic growth. That has sort of reduced substantially, but there's also signs, for example, in mining sector we could see, and some other sectors we could see some investments are still coming. They're not significant, but they're still important. And climate change and natural hazards are very sort of key risk areas. We saw in the earlier chart where drought and flooding are the key sort of risks that Afghan are facing. This chart is very interesting, and we wanted to show you this. This is in $1 billion of aid that Afghanistan received. For example, we can see between 2016 and 2020, Afghanistan received on average $4.9 billion. In 2021, there was $2 billion in humanitarian aid. In 2022, that was the highest amount of aid Afghanistan received at 3.8. And it has started to decline. By November 2024, it was $1.4 billion, which is significantly lower than even the $3.8 billion in 2022, a 76% decline. This is going to, the effect of this reduction will start to appear in 2025 and 26. We are going to see some of the activity in the private sector, some of the activity in public sector, for example, public revenue, might actually reduce because of reduction in aid. A few other points that I will quickly sort of touch on, and then we can open up for questions. Between Afghanistan and Pakistan, there are struggles and difficulties in their bilateral relations. Pakistan recently imposed both tariff and non-tariff in 2024, tariff and non-tariff barriers to the very small amount of exports that Afghanistan has to Pakistan. But at the same time, because of the blockages of the trade routes and things like that, Pakistani's export has also reduced to Afghanistan. This will be very important because Pakistan is an important destination for Afghan exports. It has other economic effects on Afghanistan as well. Even though Afghanistan over the last 10 to 15 years have managed to sort of diversify its export and import markets to Central Asia and Iran, Pakistan will still remain important. Narcotics ban or the ban on the poppy will be an important area. There are estimations that 400,000 jobs in rural sector can be lost. That will be very significant for the Afghan economy. We can see already there are some signs of that coming in. Stability of Afghan currency and prices is very important. We have seen recently that Afghan currency was declining against international currencies, and there was a lot of sort of discussion that if that was a just a short-term phenomenon, or whether there was some sort of trend getting started. But that's acknowledging that Afghan currency have actually appreciated significantly since 2021. Changes in international aid sector, USAID has recently frozen much of its development aid. It has allowed through a waiver that continuation of humanitarian aid, but if humanitarian aid decreases or is not available, the effects will be devastating on Afghanistan, because around almost half of the aid, around 43% of the aid that Afghanistan receives come from the US. Remittances is another area where a lot of data is not available. ACAPS have published a report on this. I'm happy for you to have a look at that. But we don't have very strong estimates and data on that, but we still believe that over time, remittances can decrease, and that can have a very sort of a negative impact on the Afghan economy. One of the areas that is showing promise that can drive, counter some of these negative sort of shocks that Afghan economy is facing is querying in mining sector. In the last 3 years, we have seen, we saw the coal exports to Pakistan support the interim administration in its early stages, which was very important for them. And we have seen recently that tens of mining contracts have been signed, both with domestic and international companies. And some of these, especially in the oil and gas sector, are very important. If they can manage to scale those, and they can manage to have that mining sector sort of produce and extraction starts, I think that can support both public sector and could create a very broad spectrum sort of aid and reduce trade deficit for Afghanistan, which could be very important. Of course, it's still a sector that we don't know whether that will happen or not. That was it from my side. Happy to chat through questions or hear other thoughts if there is any, or answer questions. So I will mute and allow for question and answer.